Oh man, I love that. That song is called Nigun Mitzpeh by Rabbi Shlomo Katz. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? We've got a barnstormer of a page tonight. Let's light up the darkness. You notice the new lighter? We went through the gas of the other lighter that I had, which I bought brand new and only used for lighting the wisdom candle. That's how many days we've been learning together. How great. Who's with us tonight? Paula in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, James in Indianapolis, Melissa in Great Neck, Yehuda in South Carolina, John in Sedona, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom saying Shavua Tov, Haverim, Lucy in Minnesota, Renee in Indy, Carolyn must stop watching the Oscars as it's time for AT. Oscars, schmoskers. What are you going to learn from watching the Oscars? Just a bunch of nonsense. Donna in Bahama, Ann in Merced, Tracy in Oklahoma, Nancy in North Carolina, Dorothy in PA, Rochelle in Modesto, Sharon in New Jersey. Dorothy loves the music. Isn't Shlomo Katz the best? He's a personal friend and he's just one of the greatest musicians in the world. Sandy in Michigan, Jennifer in Florida, PK in Colorado, and people greeting each other. I said Sharon in New Jersey. I think I did. Who else over there? Gigi in British Columbia over on the YouTube side. A big thank you and Yasher Koach to Rena Klein, who is sponsoring tonight's class. So tonight, it's still daylight here in LA, technically, but I know for most of the people watching the show, it's already nighttime. And so we are in a very special day of the calendar. It's also going to be the source of our Torah thought today. This is the 14th of Iyar, Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, which if you made the journey with us, through Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Passover, you learned all about Pesach Sheni. This is that second opportunity when they were bringing the first Korban Pesach in the wilderness, right? So it's actually the second. The first Korban Pesach, the first Paschal lamb, was when they were still in Egypt, the night before the children of Israel left Egypt. Then a year later, we had already received the Torah, and now we were going to observe the laws of Passover as given in the Torah. And that include bringing the Paschal lamb with all of the laws that are attendant to it. And it's a big and beautiful, important festival for Israel. And there were certain people who were tameh, ritually impure, because they were attending to the dead, doing that incredibly important mitzvah of burying the dead, attending the dead, escorting the dead to their burial place. So they had contracted tumas hames, the ritual impurity of touching a corpse, and therefore they were disqualified from bringing the Korban Pesach, from bringing the Passover offering. They went to Moses. They said, hey, we'd like to participate. We know that we're not allowed according to the law, but, we did a good deed. Are we going to be left out? Moses said, I don't know the answer. Let me check with God. Moses asked God. God said the people were correct to ask. They have a second chance. Pesach Sheni, the second Passover, 1 month later. My friend, Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, likes to say that the spiritual lesson of Pesach Sheni is that God never gives up on any of us, right? A few people asked, hey, we are disqualified. Can we still participate? And because they petitioned Moses and Moses petitioned God, the Torah was altered. The law was changed on their behalf. That law benefits a lot of people, both in that generation and all the subsequent generations, who didn't ask, right? But the law still benefits them. That's what God liked about that adjustment to the law. And it's this idea that God never gives up on any of us. those who ask and want to come close and make mistakes, those who ask and want to come close and in their zeal do a lot of good but create a problem for themselves, and those who don't even know to ask, those who are so disconnected from the tradition that they don't realize that second Passover is going on. Some are so disconnected from the tradition they didn't even know first Passover was going on. But God, the Holy One, our Father in heaven, is always waiting for us to come back. That's the lesson of Pesach Sheni. And it is also the yahrzeit of Rena Klein's dad. His name was Yosef ben Yekutiel HaKohen. He was a Cohen, a descendant of Aaron, of the priestly family. We wish him that his memory will always be for a blessing, and we dedicate our learning tonight to his memory, and may the merit of our learning accrue to him in the world to come, in the world of souls, and take his neshama, his soul, ever higher in that world. And we say amen. And Rena, thank you so much for sponsoring our class tonight, and may the Holy One shower you and all your loved ones with unlimited blessings. And we say amen. Okay. Tonight's daf, we are on Yud Dalet, page 14 of Tractate Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Yom Kippur, or as Michael Stein says, Yom Kippur. How he learned from his rabbi, but my Rav says Yom Kippur, so I'm going to say Yom Kippur. We're finally moving on from the first Mishna of Tractate Yoma, which is about the fact that the high priest, before Yom Kippur, before he serves in Yom Kippur, when the temple is standing, he is sequestered in the temple compound, in the special chamber of the Parhedron, for 7 days to ensure that he is in a state of purity. And both two reasons, not just one, two reasons, to ensure he's in a state of purity on Yom Kippur and that he's properly prepared. Like Moses being sequestered for the first part of his journey to receive the Torah, he's prepared so that he is prepared in sanctity, he's prepared in spirit, he is prepared in every way for his encounter with the divine. The high priest on Yom Kippur will have an encounter with the divine presence, the Shekhinah, in the Holy of Holies, and he must be as ready can be. So tonight we move into the second Mishnah, and we start to learn, okay, so what's he doing during those 7 days of preparation? Here's the Mishnah, and I'm going to read the Mishnah, and then we're going to get into, this is actually one of the more famous passages of the Talmud, because it includes this incredible paradox that puzzled the sages, it puzzled King Solomon, it puzzles us, and let's see what you and I together can come up with tonight to help our understanding of this great paradox, the high priest's purification paradox. Here's the Mishnah. During all 7 days of the high priest's sequestering before Yom Kippur, he sprinkles the blood of the daily burnt offering, and he burns the incense, and he removes the ashes of the lamp of the candelabrum, the menorah, and he sacrifices the head and the hind leg of the daily offering. The high priest performs these tasks in order to grow accustomed to the services that he will perform on Yom Kippur. On all the other days of the year, if the high priest wishes to sacrifice any of the offerings, he sacrifices them, as the high priest sacrifices any portion that he chooses first, and he takes any portion that he chooses first, right? So on all the other days of the year, we have a rotation of the ordinary priests, right? There were a lot of priests in any generation, all these descendants of Aaron, but there's only one high priest at a time. So the rest of the priests, all these different families, that patrilineally can trace their lineage back to Aaron. There's a bunch of these families that during the first and second temple period, and they had these mishmarim, these priestly watches. And as we talked about before, each of these families would serve for 2 weeks a year, about 6 months apart. And then on the festivals, they would all be there as well. But during their regular week, as it were, there were enough priests that all the members of that family actually only had to serve 1 day of the 6 weekdays, and then all of that family together on Shabbos, right? So there was a lot of work in the temple, but there were a lot of priests to do the work. And so to see who would actually do the given tasks on any given day, there was a lottery. Who is going to clean out the bowls of oil in the menorah, the 7-branch menorah, the candelabrum in the temple? Who would clean that out in the morning and pour in the new oil and light the wicks? And who would bring the daily sacrifice? And who would put the parts that are burned on the altar? And who would eat from the sacrifices where there are parts that are eaten by the priests? And who would, clean the altar fire, etc. All the priests would have lotteries. Now, like, the work is actually, manual work, right? It's cleaning, lighting, scraping, tending a fire, scraping a fire, shoveling ashes. It's very mundane and humble work. But you're doing it in the temple on behalf of the nation, and so it's considered a great honor to do this humble work, which only priests could do, and so they would have a lottery to decide who would do what. But the high priest, there's only one of him, they accord to him the highest honor, and that includes that any particular job that he wants to do on any particular day, have at it, right? The high priest can do whichever one he wants. Now, during the 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, so they're going to be preparing him about the special avoda, the special divine service that he's going to be doing on Yom Kippur. But part of that is also going to be the daily tasks that are done every day. And they want to make sure that in terms of the daily tasks, since he can always allow the ordinary priests on any given day to do them, okay, so now during the 7 days of preparation, they're going to make sure that he is absolutely, fluent, right? That he is absolutely fluent in all of the daily practices and is ready to go. He's done these things many times, and it's just going to become second nature to him to do them absolutely right. Okay, so we got the list of the things, all these daily practices that other priests might do, but for sure the high priest is going to do, and they're listed in this Mishnah. Now, the Gemara asks, who is the Tana, meaning the rabbi of the Mishnah, the rabbi of the Mishnaic period, who taught this Mishnah? Rav Chisda said, this Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. There's something wrong in this Mishnah, at least according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. As if it were in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, it is difficult. For didn't Rabbi Akiva say, with regard to, now this is all based on the idea, which it hasn't been said in this Mishnah yet, but it's going to come later, but it's already a given, and we've studied it a couple times, that all 7 days that the high priest is sequestered in the temple, right? He left his home, he's not living in his house, he's living in that special chamber in the Temple Mount, in the temple compound. During all those 7 days, we saw he gets sprinkled with the waters of purification. Just in case he came into contact with a corpse or he walked over a grave unknowingly before he was sequestered, they're going to sprinkle him with these waters of purification every day just to make sure that if he happened to have been impure, now for sure he's going to be pure on Yom Kippur itself. Since he's being sprinkled with these waters of purification every day, what are the waters of purification? This is a very pure spring water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. There were only 9 red heifers in the history of the Jewish people. They were slaughtered in a special ceremony. They were burned. Their ashes were stored in the Temple Mount in a special place. Some of those ashes were mixed with some water, and this becomes the water of purification that is sprinkled on a person who becomes tameh from contact with a human corpse. That's what the waters of purification are for. And just in case the priest was impure and didn't even know it, because he walked over a grave or incidentally came into contact with a corpse and didn't know, just in case, they're going to sprinkle him with these waters every day. But there's a problem. Now we're going to see what the problem is. So this Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, because if it were in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, it would be difficult. For did not Rabbi Akiva say, with regard to a ritually pure person, one who is tahor, upon whom a sprinkling of purification water fell, it renders him impure. Right? The purpose of the waters of purification is that if a person is impure, so part of his purification process, he's going to be sprinkled on the third and seventh day of his purification process with these waters of purification. And then at the end of the 7 days, he's going to immerse in the mikveh. He's going to wait for nightfall, and then he's going to become pure. But now Rabbi Akiva is telling us, but with regard to a person who is pure, if waters of purification fell on him, he becomes impure. It's like, what? Wait a minute. The waters of purification make a person pure. Now you're telling me that if he is pure and the waters of purification fall on him, he becomes impure. Why? That right away, we're wondering why. Why would that be? Let's see. So this is based on the enigmatic, the strange and surprising and difficult to understand principle with regard to the water of the red heifer. It purifies the ritually impure, but it also renders impure those who are ritually pure. And if so, how can the high priest perform the temple service each day during those 7 days? The high priest is sprinkled with purification water on every one of the 7 days of his sequestering due to the possibility that he was impure with impurity imparted by a corpse. However, it is possible that he is ritually pure. It is probable that he is ritually pure. If he is ritually pure, then the sprinkling will render him impure. And if he is impure, then how can he perform the temple service? We know that any priest who becomes tameh, ritually impure, is disqualified from bringing an offering on the altar or lighting the candelabrum or doing any of the divine service on the Temple Mount. So if we're sprinkling him to make sure that he's pure, but if he already was pure, then the sprinkling makes him impure, then how can he perform the temple service every day, which he needs to practice so that he's ready to go on Yom Kippur? As it was taught in a baraisa that it is written, Numbers 19, this is the verse where we get this idea, and the pure person will sprinkle it, the waters of purification, upon the impure person. Now, this emphasis that he sprinkles the water upon the impure person comes to teach that if he's sprinkled on the ritually impure person, that person becomes pure. But if he's sprinkled on the pure person, that person becomes ritually impure. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. Now, the rabbis don't agree with Rabbi Akiva. So when we talk about this extreme paradox, it's actually only according to Rabbi Akiva. The rabbis are going to interpret this verse a little bit differently. We're still going to have this paradox that waters of purification can render a person impure. But it's not going to be quite as strong a case as the way Rabbi Akiva makes it. Let's see how it works. So this is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. The rabbis say these matters are stated to teach that it is considered sprinkling only if it is performed on items that are susceptible to impurity. Whereas if the water was sprinkled on items not susceptible to impurity, it is not considered sprinkling. Right? So the rabbis are going to sort of back away from the paradox a little bit, and they're going to say, well, if you sprinkle the waters of purification on an animal that couldn't become pure through the waters of purification anyway, then we're not going to worry about this because it's not considered sprinkling. Sprinkling means that you sprinkle the waters of purification on something that is impure and capable of becoming impure, and that it will purify. So then we ask, well, does that apply to a person who is pure? I mean, he's susceptible to impurity. So is it called sprinkling when you sprinkle the waters of purification on a person who is pure in such a way that it's going to render him impure, right? That's the question. Now, the Gemara analyzes the basis of the dispute. What is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? Instead of writing, the Torah could have written, and the pure person will sprinkle it upon, the Torah did write, and the pure person will sprinkle it upon the impure person. But let the merciful one write instead, and the pure person will sprinkle it upon him. And it would have been clear that it is upon the aforementioned impure person that was just described in the previous verse. So what is taught by the phrase that he sprinkles upon the impure person who was already mentioned in the previous verse? So learn from it that if he sprinkled on the impure person, that person becomes pure. But if he sprinkled it on the pure person, that person becomes impure. This is the view of Rabbi Akiva. The rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva, they say with regard to that phrase, it comes to teach that it is only considered sprinkling if it is performed on items susceptible to impurity. However, here, with regard to sprinkling purification water on a pure person, it is derived through a kal v'chomer and a fortiori inference that he remains ritually pure. For if the water falls on the impure person and it makes him pure, then how much more so if the water of purification falls upon a pure person, that person should obviously remain pure. If these waters of purification are so purifying that they can take an impure person and make him pure, well, then if they fall on a pure person, it's like they should make him more pure, not less, right? That's how the rabbis read it, and that would make sense. But Rabbi Akiva could respond to this kal v'chomer inference, to this a fortiori inference, according to Rabbi Akiva. And this is what King Solomon was talking about when he said at Kohelet, Ecclesiastes 7:23, King Solomon said, I said I would become wise, but it eludes me. Even Solomon couldn't understand this. According to tradition, even Solomon, the wisest of all people in all of history, even Solomon in his great wisdom could not understand the contradictory nature of the sprinkling of purification water that purifies an impure person and impurifies a pure person. And the rabbis ascribe Solomon's bewilderment to a different aspect of this law. The one who sprinkles the water and the one upon whom one sprinkles the water, they are pure, but one who touches the water unrelated to sprinkling, he becomes impure. Right? So the rabbis are going to back away and say, well, no, if you sprinkle the water of purification on a person who's pure, he remains pure. However, if somebody who is not a priest involved in sprinkling, whether he's, why is he sprinkling? He wants to sprinkle somebody who is impure. That's why the sprinkling is out. It's done with a branch of hyssop. So why does he have, the cup with the water purification in it and the branch of hyssop that he's going to dip into that vessel of water to bring it out to sprinkle? There must be somebody who is impure, or at least suspected of impurity, that they're going to sprinkle, right? There's a reason for the sprinkling to happen. So this person who has a reason to sprinkle and the one who gets sprinkled, they're not going to become impure by virtue of touching the waters of purification. But a third person who has nothing to do with sprinkling or being sprinkled, if he touches the waters of purification, yes, he will become impure. So again, the waters of purification can render a pure person impure, but at least according to the rabbis, it's not somebody who's engaged in an effort to purify, whether the one who sprinkles or the one being sprinkled. It's this third party who should have known better than to come into contact with those waters. He becomes impure if he touches the waters of purification. It's still a paradox, but at least it's not as great a paradox as Rabbi Akiva, who says anybody who's pure, who comes into contact with these waters, including the sprinkler or the sprinklee, would become impure by virtue of touching those waters. But we still have the paradox, even according to the rabbis. The Gemara asks, is the one who sprinkles the water actually pure? Now, this is according to the rabbis. The one who sprinkles, he doesn't become impure. But the Gemara is going to challenge that. Isn't it written, he who sprinkles the purification waters will wash his clothes, and he who touches the purification waters will be unclean until evening. That's Numbers 19:21. So the Gemara responds, what is the meaning of the term, he who sprinkles? It means he who touches. But isn't it written, he who sprinkles? The one who sprinkles, he will wash his clothes. Why does he have to wash his clothes? Because they became impure. Isn't it written, he who sprinkles? And isn't it written in the same verse, and he who touches? So the rabbis who are saying, well, no, when it talks about the one who sprinkles, it means the one who touches, right? The third party, who's not either the sprinkler or the sprinklee. He's the one who becomes impure, even though he was pure because he touches the waters of purification. But the Gemara is saying, well, wait a minute. In the verse itself, it distinguishes the one who sprinkles from the one who touches. Those are two different people. And furthermore, in that verse, one who sprinkles requires washing of his clothes, indicating a more severe level of impurity. Whereas the one who touches, he doesn't require washing of his clothes. Apparently, when it is written, he who sprinkles, it is not referring to the one who touches. Rather, the rabbis say, what is the meaning of he who sprinkles? It refers to one who carries the water of purification. And the Gemara asks, but if so, let the merciful one write, one who carries. What is the reason that it says he who sprinkles in reference to carrying? And the Gemara answers, this use of the term sprinkling to depict carrying teaches us that in order to become impure from carrying the water of purification, now he's even involved in the process. He's like doing part of the work. He's bringing the water of purification to the priest who will sprinkle on the one who became impure and requires sprinkling. So this person who's carrying the water, it's not like he's some Joe Schmo who stumbled onto the water of purification and touches what he shouldn't have been touching. He's doing a job. He's carrying the water of purification to the priest. Nevertheless, he's going to become impure by virtue of carrying that water. But say the rabbis, why is the one who carries compared to the one who sprinkles, or even called the one who sprinkles? It's because he's only going to become tameh, he's only going to become impure by virtue of carrying those waters of purification if there is a minimum measure of those waters of purification, right? If he's only carrying a few drops, he's not going to become impure. But if he's carrying a proper amount, more than the minimum amount of these waters of purification, then he will become impure. And the Gemara asks, well, this works out well according to the one who said that sprinkling requires a minimum measure of water, as then the concept of a measure required for sprinkling has meaning. However, according to the one who said that sprinkling does not require a minimum measure of water, and in fact that is the law, when a person who was impure because he touched a human corpse and he has to go through a 7-day purification process and he's going to be sprinkled with the waters of purification on the 3rd and 7th days of his impurity, how much water needs to be sprinkled on him? Any amount. There is no minimum measure. So if there's no minimum measure, how can we say that the one who carries the water is only going to become impure if he carries a minimum measure? There is no minimum measure. The Gemara answers, even according to the one who said that sprinkling does not require a minimum measure of water, that applies only to the measure of the waters of purification that must be actually sprinkled onto the back of the person who is impure and needs to be purified. However, in the vessel in which that water is carried, there needs to be a minimum measure, namely the amount that if you dip the branch of hyssop, branches and leaves, right, a branch with leaves of hyssop, and you dip it into that vessel, there has to be enough water in that vessel to cover a certain amount of those branches with leaves. However, in the vessel into which one dips the hyssop, in order to sprinkle the water, a certain measure of water is required. As we learned in a Mishna, how much water should be in the vessel so that it will be equivalent to the measure required for sprinkling? It must be equivalent to the measure required to dip the tops of the stems of the hyssop branch into the water and sprinkle it. Apparently, even according to the one who said that there is no minimum measure of water in the vessel in terms of how much lands on the person who gets sprinkled, there is a minimum measure of how much needs to be in the vessel to get the water onto the branch from which the sprinkling will be done. Abaye said, even if you say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who said that the purification water impurifies the pure, the difficulty can be resolved. Because the original issue is, according to Rabbi Akiva, right, if somebody who's pure gets sprinkled with the waters of purification, he becomes impure. If he's impure, then how can he perform the divine service every day, which he needs to become super familiar with? So the high priest, when he's sequestered for those 7 days, he does all the work of all the priests. So he gets really familiar with that work. But if he was pure when he went into the 7 days of sequestering, and they sprinkled water of purification on him, at least according to Rabbi Akiva, he would become impure. If he became impure, how can he perform the divine service? And now Abaye is going to answer that question. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. Why? The high priest performs the temple service for the entire day on each of the 7 days of the sequestering. And only toward evening, after he's done all that work for the day, that's when the priests sprinkle the purification water upon him. So even if he actually was pure, that he never touched a corpse before he went into his sequestering, and the sprinkling waters rendered him impure, according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, he immerses immediately after that sprinkling, and he observes the requirement to wait until sunset, at which point he is purified and he's prepared to serve the next day. They don't sprinkle him with those waters in the morning. They sprinkle him in the evening. So even if those waters rendered him impure, that's a low level of impurity. It's enough after you've been, if you actually were pure and then you were sprinkled with these waters of purification, it made you impure. What do you do to become pure again? Immerse in the mikveh, wait till nightfall, and then you're pure again. So he's ready, right? He's ready to perform the divine service according to Abaye. I'm almost done. So if you got questions or comments, get them in now. In fact, here's the thing. Now we've learned about this paradox, right? That the waters of purification can render the pure person impure, at least according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. And even according to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva, if it's not, somebody other than the sprinkler or the sprinklee, some other person, even one who's helping them, if he's pure and he carries the waters of purification, doing that will render him impure. So even according to the rabbis, these waters of purification can render a person impure. And my question is, what's the spiritual lesson of that? What is the inner dimension of this teaching? It's a great paradox. It's an interesting paradox. But what do we learn from it that we can take into our own lives? So I actually was speaking to Rabbi Yehuda Mintz, who I mentioned earlier, who has this great teaching about Pesach Sheni. It's that second chance, that everyone has a second chance. God is always waiting for us, just like if we couldn't serve him at the first Passover, we can serve him at the second Passover. What do we learn about these waters of purification that render the pure person impure? It takes you down a peg, right? Even if you're a person who is in all things in life, aspiring to a state of absolute purity, right? If you're a holy roller, if you're somebody, who can get a little bit like, okay, yeah, I'm doing everything. I'm following every rule. I'm doing it to the nth degree. I'm guarding myself. I'm keeping my distance from all sources of impurity. I'm maintaining myself in an absolute level of purity. I'm drawing close to pureness at all times. I want to be as pure as I can possibly be. So how would I draw myself to the absolute highest level of purity? By coming near the waters of purification that purify all the impure people. And when I come close enough and I touch them, what happens to me? I become impure, right? And it brings that person down a peg. It teaches humility. That's what it's all about. It makes a person modest. What is the greatest compliment that we can give to a Jew, right, or to any person? It's to somehow be compared to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu, to our teacher Moses, the greatest prophet of all time. There was never a prophet before like him, and there will never be another prophet as close to godliness as him. No one ever reached that level of speaking face to face with God and surviving and coming back. So he's the greatest. He's, in terms of our tradition, Moses is the greatest human being of all time. What is the adjective that the Torah uses to describe the great, great Moses? He was the humblest of all people, right? The best thing that we can say about him, the greatest attribute that we can use to describe Moses, is that he was the humblest of all people. So whenever we start to get a little full of ourselves, we need to come back a peg, come down a peg, right? And this paradox, that the waters of purification can render the pure person impure, it brings someone down a peg, and it's a gift. It's a gift. It's a gift that in our struggles to become more holy, to become more pure, to become more learned, it's like the zeal of the zealot, the zeal of the convert, the zeal of the one who's, religious from birth and ever trying to become more and more holy. And even this person can slip. It's like built into the system that at some point he's going to slip by struggling to come so high in his holiness. He's going to slip. It's built into the system, and it's a gift. It's a gift. How much more we, who don't come into contact with the waters of purification because they haven't existed in 2,000 years, and who can't compare ourselves to high priests in their 7 days of sequestering, and who can't obviously compare ourselves to Moses, the greatest of all prophets of all time, who can't compare ourselves to the sages of blessed memory, these incredibly wise teachers, if in our own struggles to get up that ladder of holiness and to just be a little bit more of a mensch today than we were yesterday, a little bit more of a decent human being today than we were yesterday, if they are going to slip in their efforts to become pure, obviously we're going to slip in our efforts to become more pure. And we're going to slip in our efforts to become better at our professions and to become better, in whatever athletic pursuits we're involved in, whatever profession we're involved in, when we're trying to make our family life work better, make our relationships work better, everything that we're trying to do, we're going to make mistakes and we're going to slip. And when we slip, it's a gift. It's a gift. It teaches us what we're trying to do, how difficult it is to attain, how difficult it is to stay there, how much work it takes to get up the ladder and stay up there. Every time we slip, don't panic, don't despair. The slip itself is a gift that we can work and then we just, pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and get back on that ladder and try to be climbing again. That's what I've got for us today. Let us see your comments and questions. Carolyn, could this be akin to ensuring the choosing of our words carefully, in that adding waters of purification to one who is already pure would perhaps be unnecessary, and in that sense be like using too many words or a poor choice of words that takes away from the true meaning? Beautiful teaching, Karen. Absolutely right. A teaching very near to Nina's heart, I must say, because she's always, coaching me. I'm a yacker. I easily fall into talking too much, saying too much, using too many words when fewer will do. It's a lesson I'm constantly trying to learn. And that lesson of picking one's words wisely is so important because, there's a moment when we've communicated the message, bang, it falls, it fell, it went, it communicated, it bridged the gap. And then we keep talking and we actually weaken the message. Beautiful. Another example that I was thinking of earlier today is addiction. Think about a medicine, a pain reliever, right? That when you are sick, when you are injured, man, that medicine is gold. It makes life bearable. We keep taking that medicine beyond what we need. We become healthy and keep taking a medicine that is only designed for the injured or the ill. We can fall into addiction and end up in a terrible place, right? So that very same water purification that can bring us up out of our impurity, if we keep taking it, now it's going to drop us down. Same, with all kinds of substances that a little at the right time in the right way can be tremendous. It can even help us to find insights in Torah, right? When wine goes in, secrets come out. That's in the right measure, right? A little bit of intoxicant, especially on Purim, then we might see things in the Torah that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. But keep drinking, and the wrong secrets will come out and we'll blabbermouth, and who knows what harm we might cause. Mark, what's the size of the vessel? So he's talking about the minimum measure for sprinkling with the waters of purification. And we said that there has to be enough water in the vessel so that the branches, become wet. So that when the priest pulls out the hyssop branch, that he's going to sprinkle on the person, who became impure by virtue of coming into contact with a corpse or walking over a grave, etc., that he's going to be sprinkled. How big is the vessel? I don't know. It's a great question. Maybe we'll cover that when we actually get more into, this kind of purification elsewhere. Here we're just talking about in the context of the high priest being sequestered. So I don't know if the vessel, if they give a size for it or not, but good question. Yosef, you may have mentioned this as I'm late, but is this hyssop and water sprinkling what David wrote about in Tehillim? So he's asking about in Psalms, probably, but I'm not sure which particular Psalm you're talking about. But I'm sure David mentions this sprinkling somewhere. I just can't come up with an example off the top of my head. Jennifer, if there were not a risk of losing purity, someone might be tempted to seek sprinkling regularly, just to be sure. With the risk, we are forced to be more conscious of the true state of our purity and only seek purifying if when we really need it. being aware of our state is an important aspect of our purifying. 100%. 100%. And in fact, if these waters of purification didn't have this property of rendering somebody who is already pure, making him impure, then you're exactly right. People would be careless, right? They would be like, yeah, put some water on me. I want to make sure. And the stateliness and the kind of the grandeur and the kedusha, right? What is kedusha? Holiness. What does the word really mean in Hebrew? It means setting something apart. Really feeling its specialness by setting it apart. God is holy, so we shall be holy. God is absolutely apart from anything else in the world. There's nothing like God. God is fully apart from anything else that could be, nothing can be compared to God. So God is completely kadosh, right? Holy, set apart. We need to set ourselves apart. That means we have to monitor our holiness. We have to monitor the holiness of the objects, the sacred objects that we use in the rituals of our lives, and treat them with respect. Simple example. The knife that I use to slice the challah at the Friday night dinner, right? When we make a blessing on bread, motzi lechem min haaretz, right? So we'll cut off some of the bread after we say the blessing, and then I'll slice a bunch of pieces to pass around to the people at our dinner table. So it's not that there's anything inherently sacred about that knife, but I have a dedicated knife for that purpose. I don't use a regular bread knife for that. I have the challah knife, right? And so when you treat matters that are involved in your life of ritual, in your life of holiness, as special, then that elevates all of the ritual and all of the idea of aspiring to holiness in our lives. Michael, perfect example, Sal. One of my jobs is sitting on a county committee that provides funding for treatment of people with addictions. Talmudic wisdom at its best. He must be referring to this idea that medicine is good in the right measure and can do tremendous harm if it's given to the wrong person or in the wrong measure. And we could look at the waters of purification in that way. Sean, isn't everyone impure? So how do you make yourself pure today? Beautiful question. So Sean is referring to the fact that all these laws are only practical laws when the temple is standing, right? So the idea of purifying yourself so that you could enter the Temple Mount only applied when the temple was standing. Since the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago, there is no water of sprinkling, and there is no making sure that you're tahor, that you are pure. And in fact, we're all assumed to be in a state of impurity. That is true. The only exception is who immerses. Married women once a month after counting the 7 clean days after their menses end, then they immerse, and then they become permitted to their husbands. Those are the laws of family purity. But the husband didn't immerse, right? So it's really only about her becoming permitted again. That's a law that we can still follow. And the convert, right? One who becomes a Jew, he has an obligation to immerse. But that's not really related to Tum and Tahara as it was practiced in ancient times, when the idea was to make sure you're in an absolute physical state of purity so you could enter the Temple Mount. So now, how do we replace those states of purity and that purification process when we're all impure all the time? And the answer is, number one, we study these laws. By studying them, we actually rise in holiness and in purity. So the main thing is that we study them. And the second thing is, we've replaced these processes with other processes, namely prayer and study and teshuvah, right? And tzedakah, giving to charity. So these are the things we do now. We study, we give money to charity, or we donate our time to righteous causes. We pray for help in sort of becoming more holy and in atoning for our sins and changing our very nature so that we become people who don't transgress. And that's what teshuvah is all about. And that has, for the last 2,000 years, really replaced that purification process in terms of its importance in our lives of faith. Sharon, considering the rarity of the red heifer, might this have been protective to prevent unnecessary usage? Very good. A nice practical concern that God might have said, hey, listen, don't overuse these waters of purification. Stay away from them unless you absolutely need them, because the red heifer, not coming along very often. I also read a story today about the great Rav Moshe Feinstein. A couple generations ago, like he was it, right? He was everyone. If you had a question of Jewish law, the ultimate authority was Moshe Feinstein. So somebody came to him once and said a red heifer had been born. They had observed a red heifer being born, and so they came to said, "It's so exciting! There's a red heifer. It must be that Mashiach is going to come very soon because now there's a red heifer." Maybe it turned out that, I think it didn't work out, right? Like maybe the red heifer developed a blemish before it came of age. Eventually, it didn't work out. But at the time that it was born, it was a pure red heifer. And they came to Rav Moshe and they said, wow, there's a red heifer born. It must be that Moshe's around the corner. And he's like, uh-huh. And they're like, Rav Moshe, why aren't you excited? He said, every day I pray that Mashiach, the Messiah, will come today. This red heifer that you told me was just born, it won't be ready, to offer itself for the waters of purification, which we will need when the third temple is built, when Mashiach comes. But this particular red heifer, it won't be ready for that for another couple of years. I'm not going to get all excited that Mashiach might be here in 2 years. I want Mashiach now. It's a great story because that's more of a real Hasidic, the Hasidic tradition is so excited about Mashiach now, especially Chabad. Rav Moshe was more from that Litvish tradition, a little bit more focused on the law and study. But here he's evincing this real attitude of, we want Mashiach now. I'm not going to be so excited that a red heifer might be ready in 2 years. Mashiach could come any moment. Then you say, well, wait a minute. If you're telling me that when Mashiach comes, the third temple is going to go up in one day, the priests are going to have to be ready to serve, we're all impure, they're going to need waters of purification, and we haven't seen a red heifer, how are they going to be able to serve? And the answer is, God always prepares the cure even before we're aware of the disease. The refuah before the makkah, the cure before we even know that plague is here. Right? So if we're going to need a red heifer in order to make waters of purification so the priest can serve on the day that the third temple goes up, which is the day that the Messiah is announced, we'll discover that the red heifer was here all along. We won't have such a problem that we'll have to wait and have an empty, unused third temple for any, extended amount of time. This is our faith. And finally, Steve Ribbich says the award for the category of Best Talmud Teacher for the water sprinkling and purity goes to envelope opening, Sal Litvak. You are very kind, Steve. If people want to be watching the Oscars, I'm not going to keep you from it any longer. But to me, this was a very exciting page dealing with the paradox of the waters of purification. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow to learn page 15 in Tractate Yoma. Have a terrific evening.